927 FM, 95.3 HD4. That's digital radio, the most powerful radio signal going out 65 miles. And the gradation so fine that if there were a separate graph marking the hosts and the guests' Adam's apples bopping, there would be a separate line, and you would be able to read the movement of that organ in the throat of your male guest. And this is David Toulis, male host, arguing for local economy and the free markets here in Chattanooga and beyond, arguing that you should love your neighbor and buy local. And we are at 800-8949, 800-8949, brought to you by yournews.com, yournews.com. There is in Christendom, in many ways, a tax revolt. Tithing is at a very low ebb. It's maybe about 2 or 3%. The scriptures argue 10% of your increase, and yet many Christians, thinking themselves freed from ancient constraints, reject that. And the substance of the church is at low ebb, and giving also at a low ebb. There is a man named Patrick Johnson who lives in Kansas City, Missouri. He's married. He and his wife Jennifer have 4 children, only one left in the house. He's a man who's grown up in the South, and he has as his calling today a ministry. It's an organization, a nonprofit that's aimed at encouraging Christians and churches and others, maybe people who are just moral and of goodwill, getting them to think in the direction of more giving, how to be generous. What is generosity? Why is generosity really part of the Christian ethic? Patrick, how is it that you got into this organization of which you're the president, Generous Church? What is it all about?
So that's a great question, David. Great to be with you this morning. So I was actually an institutional money manager. I was managing money for a bank down in Mississippi, living in Mississippi at the time. And in 2002, really had a sort of an epiphany of, we've got all this wealth in the United States. We live in the wealthiest country during the most wealthiest of times. But yet, if you look at giving among Christians and just the general public as a percentage of income, it's very low. As a matter of fact, it's lower than during the height of the Great Depression. And just through reading and a number of different circumstances, I said, you know what, something's got to change here. We've got so much. We oftentimes don't feel like we have so much, but in reality, if you look at the statistics, we've got so much, and yet we're not giving. And so it's interesting because in Chattanooga, you have a community that has a real history of charitable giving, the McCollum Foundation and others. And so the McCollum Foundation really had a vision to see a revolution of generosity across the country. They started a ministry called Generous Giving. I was brought on board in 2003 to really go across the country and find out how we could spur on this revolution of generosity. And I've been doing it since 2003, and have been in churches and outside of churches, in communities all across the country, really just saying, how can we spur people on to more giving? And that's what I've focused my life on for the last 15 years.
Well, Patrick Johnson, if Christians are not giving, and if they're not tithing, which I would say is understood to be something of some compulsion, like a tax, if they're not tithing and they're not giving, what is the reasoning for it? I mean, paint in the best light you can the reasons why the status quo is as it is. Why, from their perspective, from the perspective of the individual church member, why is the status quo absolutely adequate?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think there's a number of different things. We've done surveys. So we have around 40,000 Christians we've surveyed in churches to find out what are their motivations, what are their barriers to giving. And, so I think a couple of things. Number one, I don't think there's intentionality. So, think about the pace of the world today, how fast we go. A lot of times, if you're going to give, you have to be very intentional. We just did a survey in a church, and if you look at people, they say they take care of their family first. About 65% of people in churches take care of their family first. And then if there's anything left over to give, they're sort of giving out of leftovers. That's 65 to probably 70% of people in most churches. So I would say one of the number one reasons is we're not intentional. Number two, I would say we don't feel like we have margin. Even though we've got more wealth than we've ever had in the history of the world, there's a lot of narratives out there in culture that say, you don't have enough, or you will only be satisfied if you have this type of car or this type of house. And even though we have a lot, we don't feel like we have a lot. And since we don't feel like we have a lot, then when we look to give, we feel like we there might be a scarcity mentality there. So I think intentionality, I think scarcity mentality. I'd say a third thing is relationships. You think about it, we live in a culture with Facebook and all the different things. We have very loose relationships now. A lot of us only have relationships online. There's nothing wrong with those loose ties. But if you look at giving, it happens in the context of deeper relationships. And so I would say a scarcity of relationships probably contribute to it as well. Does that make sense?
Well, it does. Are you suggesting that the relationships that people like my listener maybe should have are with people who are poor, desperate, hurting, maybe people who are in a jail, or who are too poor to worry about changing the oil in an old car after 40,000 miles? You should change your oil every 3. And how does my listener connect? How can my listener find such people? Is part of his intentionality in giving, find people of the poorer kind? Patrick Johnson.
That's a great question. And I'd say 2 things. Number one, I do think you need to be intentional about engaging the poor. Our surveys show that a large percentage of people who live in suburban Christian enclaves, they never run across any poor people. We go to work, we come home, we close our garage door, and if we're not careful, we can go months and months and months without ever coming face to face with poverty. And so one of the things we encourage churches to do is to create avenues where people can get face to face with the poor. And it's not just that we are the good guys and the poor are the bad guys. That's not it at all. There's a mutual exchange. I know that when I've gone to different countries and been in different situations where I've been face to face with poverty, I get a lot out of it as well. So it is a mutually beneficial relationship. So that's number one. I think you have to be intentional. Otherwise, you won't see it.
Tillerson, out Bolton coming in, you've been there. You've seen what it's like.
I mean, I'm in a neighborhood in Kansas City. I'm looking out my side. It's a relatively nice neighborhood. There's brokenness all around me. I know my next door neighbors. I have opportunities not to necessarily give them financially, but to give them my presence or my compassion when they need it. So I think you need to think outside of, it's more than just giving to the poor. It's also where are the needs right around you, maybe in your own family or in your own neighborhood, that it might not necessarily be financial giving, but maybe there's some other type of giving you can do there as well.
Well, you're suggesting that my listener, Patrick Johnson of Generous Church, you might say he should draw from God's grace, but he should also draw from maybe within his own heart, compassion and time. I think the giving of time is maybe the first thing that he should give or she should give, because if you don't give the time to someone just to listen or ask questions, then you're not going to really know. And I think the middle class, upper class people who would tune into my show possibly just can't. They don't have the means, the wherewithal to generate these compassionate moments or opportunities. They just don't give the time.
Yeah, exactly. And I've read a book one time, and if you think of it, we all have budgets. A lot of us do budgets for our finances. What if you did a budget for your time? It'd be fascinating to see if you went a week and you tracked all of your time in hourly blocks, how much time we actually waste. And so, there's an issue of intentionality of your time, just like it would be on your budget, on your finances as well. So I'd encourage people to think about, am I really spending my time in ways that are bringing self-actualization or bringing value to my life? And a lot of times, if I just sit around and watch TV for 3 or 4 hours a night, compared to getting out and serving someone or serving with someone or doing something meaningful, it doesn't compare, but yet we get in ruts.
What should my listener do practically? Let's say my listener works for somebody else in a company. He has a kind of regular hours, and let's say 8 to 5. He has maybe a couple of children at home. He's married, and he has a mortgage. And he doesn't really have any vices, but he may like some sports, to watch TV. What are some things he can do as just a common middle class kind of person? Where can he be practical in his giving? Patrick Johnson.
Great question. So what's fascinating is if you look at how Americans spend their money, regardless of your education or if you're a doctor or you never graduate from high school or anywhere in between or whatever, the average American spends 1 out of every $2 on 2 expenditures, houses and cars. So from a financial giving perspective, one of the things we've done in my family which is a middle-class family, is we basically said we're going to spend less on those two expenditures to free money up in order to give. And so the first thing I would encourage you to do is on the financial giving side, I say look at those two expenditures, your houses and your cars, and ask yourself, am I spending 50% or more on those two expenditures? What would happen if you could get those down to 40% or 35%? Then all of a sudden you would free up 10 to 15% to save, to give. So I think a lot of times your average listener might think, well, I don't have any margin. So I would look at those two expenditures and say, what can I do to get those down? Second thing is, if you go to church, I mean, the church is one of the greatest aggregator of middle-class giving of any other organization out there. It's sort of the history and the culture of the church is that we give to the church. So I would encourage you, if you're a churchgoer, to start giving. If you're outside of a church, find a community that you can give into, because like I said earlier, you know, we give in the context of relationships. So I think community is so important in that as well. And then the third thing we already mentioned is, how can I give outside of just financial giving? So is there someone that needs my presence? Is there someone that I can just go serve, help move? So the thing is, I did a 21-day giving challenge one time where every day I tried to wake up and I tried to look for one intentional act of generosity per day for 21 days. Because really, if you think about it, David, sometimes this, like giving, like a lot of other things in our life, it's a virtue. It's something that we sort of, we have a habit of doing it. And so I did it for 21 days straight. It was an awareness. And so I set aside a habit in my life. So I would say margin, intentionality, develop a habit. Those kind of things are what I try to do.
We do thank you for tuning in here to 927. We're talking with Patrick Johnson, who runs a group called Generous Church. And now, Patrick, you're going to be in Chattanooga on the 17th of April, which is a Tuesday. And you're going to be downtown in one of our loco-centric restaurants. Tell my listener what you'll be doing there and who's invited, and can he or she attend this event?
Yeah, totally. So one of my visions is there's 300,000 churches in the United States. And if we think generosity happens in the context of relationships, churches are important to get this message of generosity that we're talking about. So I'm going to bring a pastor from Kansas City, a guy named Mike Bickley. We're coming to the Feed Table and Tavern on April 17th. And we're going to do a free lunch sponsored by the McClellan Foundation from 11:30 to 1:15. And really what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how do we create these kind of cultures of whole life generosity in churches. So what I would encourage you is, if you go to church, bring your pastor. It's free. As a matter of fact, we only have 25 spots left. We're going to cap out at about 175 people have already registered. So bring your pastor or another church leader and come, and really we're going to talk about the kind of issues we're talking about now. Are we generous in our churches? And if we're not, how do we create cultures of generosity where most of the people, most of the time, are living these kind of generous lives that not only the Bible calls us to, but even those outside the church know it's a great thing. So that's what we're going to explore and use the real life example of a church that's really doing it well.
Would you do me a favor, Patrick Johnson, and reach back, you might say, through the sociology of giving, maybe even through the psychology, and go back to the Lord Jesus? How is it that the Lord Jesus directs his people and really directs everyone to be gracious and other-centric? How does he do that? What's his claim upon us?
Yeah, that's a great question, David. So if you look at so there's a couple things. Number one, if you look at the way Jesus lived his life, so think about it. When he came and introduced his ministry, it was a ministry to the poor, those in prison, etc. So Jesus lived, his 3-year ministry that we have recorded in the Gospels was a ministry of generosity. That was an ethos. That's why the world was attracted to him. Think about how countercultural giving is in today's world. Think about how counterculture it was in the Roman Empire of Jesus' day. So number one, Jesus lived it. He modeled it for us. And then number two, we know that he gave his life. I mean, 2 Corinthians 8:9 said he became poor so that we through his poverty might become rich. So not only did he model it in his ministry, but he ultimately did the ultimate act of generosity. He gave himself so that we might live. And then what he calls us to do, if you're a Christ follower, is he's saying when you are generous, you're bringing the kingdom down to earth as it is in heaven. I mean, that's one of the ethos of the kingdom, is a kingdom of open-handedness and generosity and caring about others. So there's this holistic narrative of generosity that I think runs throughout the Gospels.
Well, I was asking earlier about the the ethic of many Christians, which is not being generous. The rate of tithing is about 2%. Americans,
Yep.
however, are considered to be very generous people. Even de Tocqueville, writing in 1835 in his Democracy in America, points out that all social needs are taken care of by the private sector. We still have one, even though we've been kind of culturally institutionalized, and there's much less individual action. If indeed the low tithing rate suggests a tax rebellion among Christians to their king and their master, how is that to be gone past? How is that to be changed? Does your work look at the tithe as part of the generous program, or is that just separate? Patrick Johnson.
No, I think whether you call it tithe, whether you call it financial giving, whatever your vernacular is, I think you can't take money off the table. So I think, if you look at what Jesus said, one of the main competitors to the heart of man, whether you serve God or you serve what? You serve mammon, money, right? So Jesus definitely went after it. He knew that money would be a huge barrier to following him. And so we don't take money off the table. We say, if you've been blessed financially, or even if you're struggling, a lot of times the first place to start is you have to give financially. But we also look beyond that, because I think Scripture says that, it's not only just the tithe or the financial giving, but it's also the weightier matters of your heart. So are you being compassionate? Are you being hospitable? Are you bringing people into your homes? Are you giving your time? Like we talked about, sometimes people have a harder time giving time. So what we say is it's really about whole life generosity, of which the tithe or financial giving is one aspect of it. But you better get that right, because there's clear warnings in Scripture that if you don't get the money part right, it's going to impact a lot of different parts of your life.
Christians complain about social welfare. They complain socialism is costing hugely the national government in taxes and in future debt on future generations. And it seems what you're suggesting, Patrick Johnson, is why complain about the modern state? And here we're in tax season. Why complain about the IRS and our ostensible obligations to file tax returns and to pay if we don't bring in the substitute personally, which is to say the care of the poor and the care of the needy, the care of the lonely, the orphan and the widow? If we don't do that ourselves, why are we complaining about the government, which has stepped in effectively to do those things for us by means of coercion and compulsion?
Yeah, I think it's a both and. I think, it's a great, I've heard people make the argument that, because we've sort of, if you look at a lot of the major hospitals in this country, they were founded by Christian people, right? And the church was a major force, has always been a major force for social good, for taking care of those that are sick and the poor and that kind of thing. And now we've got government that's sort of, taking over a lot of those things, and some would argue ineffectively and inefficiently. And I don't think it's a either or. I think it's a both and. I think there's a both and. But I tell you what, I think we need to really step up as individuals. If you think about it, your own personal generosity to those around you, you don't have levels of bureaucracy that take portions of that generosity. It's very effective because it's one-on-one. And I heard Dave Ramsey say one time during one of his webinars that if we live generously as Christians and as people in this country, a lot of what the government would have to do would disappear, that it would go down, but we're not living into that. So the challenge is, yes, we want to, if you're not happy with the political system, then politics play a role. But if you also have the power within you, all of us do, to basically live this generous life and take care of people in a more effective and efficient way. I'll mention one other thing. So I have a church that in Houston, Texas, that we work with, and they do house churches. So they have a big worship gathering on the weekend, but they have house churches, about 40 house churches across Houston. And one of the things they have found is that the benevolence among members works better in a house church environment than it does in a large church environment. And the reason that it does is because it's in the context of a relationship. If somebody's struggling, you know the story behind their struggle. And so I would blow that up to a bigger national conversation. If you were one-on-one and we were living generously, we would know the why behind people's struggle. Well, the government will never know that because they're too big. And so the encouragement was, what if we could create a revolution of generosity in individuals? Because that is a more effective way to really understand the story of people's struggle.
Well, what you're saying, Patrick Johnson, is that there's a scale problem that government can't address because government bureaucracies are so big. Food stamps and such programs, they can't evaluate. And people who come as claimants for need really do so with procedural rights. They have due process rights and so on. And so there's not people come and receive aid, and thankfulness is not required on their part. If you have these small churches that you mentioned in Texas, and people in need receive help from their neighbors who are in the same little fellowship, you have a right scale that large institutions, even if they're private, really can't match.
Amen. And if you think about Chattanooga, for example, so Chattanooga, statistics have shown that Chattanooga has been one of the most generous cities in the country for a long time. I mean, you always rank up there as one of a great generous city. And you think about, why is that the case? Well, you've got generous families there and some wealthier families, but you also have a culture of church there. I mean, I've been in Chattanooga a lot of times, and there are thriving churches, and there are a lot of churches. And that's interesting. So wherever you find churches that are thriving, or you find a lot of churches, you find higher percentages of giving among the greater population than you do in other parts of the United States where you don't. And so, I mean, think about it. If churches had cultures of generosity, then we could solve, and we are solving, a lot of the social problems that are right around us, because we're doing it in the context of neighbors and relationship, which that's the big value we have in churches.
And I appreciate what you're saying, Patrick Johnson of Generous Church, a nonprofit organization you are in Kansas City. That is really one of the arguments here on my radio station. Is called local economy and the free market. We want in Liberty people to look out for each other, to sell to each other, to do business locally, to be sort of loco-centric in their perspective, and to be aware of the scale problem. Now, just briefly, you, my listener, if you're joining us, there's an event April 17 at the Feed Table and Tavern. That's I'm trying to remember. Is that what street is that? East 10th Street, East 9th Street, but Patrick Johnson, tell my listener about this event. There are 25 more slots. It has to be reserved. It's a free meal, and the event April 17 about lunchtime deals with the question of the generous church, how to make churches generous, how to make people generous in them. Patrick, what are the details?
Yep. So April 17th, we'll go from 11:30 to 1. You can register at generouschurch.com/event. So generouschurch.com/event. You'll see a way to register on there. And really, we're feeding you. There's no cost to it. The McCollum Foundation stepped up and is funding this. And we're really going to bring a church in Kansas City that is really living into this generosity message. And what do we learn? So we'll give practical examples. We're going to really serve you. And our vision is to help Chattanooga keep this generous spirit up that we've got going. So pastors, church leaders, if you're an elder or a deacon or you're a lay leader in your church, we would invite you to come to this event.
Okay, so it's again, generouschurch.com/event. That's generouschurch.com/event. Patrick, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me, David.
This is David Toulis, and we're talking with Patrick Johnson of Generous Church, and an event, very exciting event on, I must say, gracious, loco-centric living with a charitable purpose on how to make people you know and in your church more gracious, more giving of their time, their means, their supplies, their hospitality, their money. And I argue that you should love your neighbor and buy local. David Toulis, brought to you by yournews.com, yournews.com, and Nuganomics. The number to call, 800-8949. That's 800-8949.
Traffic, news, and information. Nuga Radio. Digital FM 95.3 HD4 and 92.7 FM. 3, 2, 1. Chattanooga Radio.